Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today is one of my biggest leadership heroes. He is a United States Marine retired. He ran several large legal organizations in his day. Also, I've heard from people that he's the best contract attorney in the state of Utah. And the really good news for me is that he's my dad. I'm really happy to have you here today, Dad. It's John Bates, the first here.
Yeah.
So
Thank
welcome.
you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And, I thought it would be really great to talk with you about this because, what we talk about on the show is leadership and communication. And I think there are just an uncountable number of really great leadership lessons that I learned from you. And of course, didn't want to admit at the time. So I'm glad I get a chance to just say thanks for everything you taught me. And sorry, I resisted for so long, but it was sinking in. I just want you to know, I just couldn't let you know. And so I thought, I would have you come share some of those early influences on me, because I think those stories are just stories that can make a difference for anybody, anywhere. And the first thing I'll say is that you had you started out in the Marine Corps, and I guess you were 17, like the day you turned 17.
I joined the Marine Corps 20 days after my 17th birthday.
Yeah, you went up to talk about enlisting in the Marines, and your dad said, "No way, you're not going to do that. There's no way." And you said, "Well, okay, come with me." Or maybe I got that backwards, but you guys went together when you were 16,
that was
right?
a little bit later, though. On my 17th birthday, I was going out of my house to play tennis, and a Jeep pulled up in front with two big Marine Corps sergeants in it, and they said, "Are you John Bates?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Captain Moody would like to see you in his office." And I said, "Well, I was just going to play tennis." And he said, "Well, he'll be there at 7:00 tonight. Don't be late." So at 7:00, I was there, and it didn't take him very long to convince me that that's what I wanted to do. And, but I was 17, and that was my 17th birthday. And he said I had to have my dad sign on with me. So we made an appointment for April the 20th. And I went up there with my dad. And as we walked, my dad told me beforehand, he said, "No, you don't want to do that, son." He said, that's not what you want to do. And I said, "Well, why don't you go tell Captain Moody?" So he said, okay. So as we walked in the building, a big Marine Corps major came walking down the hallway. And my dad looked at him and said, "Gus." And the major said, "Luke." And they hugged each other. And they had known each other since the Second World War. Wow. And my dad put his arm around me and said, "This is what you want to do, son."
Wow. And that's pretty interesting.
And so that night, I raised my hand and joined the Marine Corps.
Wow.
And I had been very lucky up until that time. And I played football in high school. I had two coaches. One of them was Tally Stevens, and another one was Don Jesperson, who were both very, very good leaders and were able to inspire people just by being there, And they, Don Jesperson had been a Marine during the Second World War, and I think he who turned the Marine Corps on to me.
Oh yeah, there you go.
I never knew that for sure, but it was a very fortunate thing for me to have those two guys to begin with, and then my very first platoon sergeant in the Marine Corps was a guy by the name of Bill Pastore. And Bill Pastore had joined the Marine Corps when he was 16. He'd lied about his age during the Second World War. And as a result, he had been on numerous landings in the Pacific during the Second World War. He'd gotten out, then he went back in Korea. And
Dad, just for anybody that's not a World War II buff, say a little bit about what numerous landings in the Pacific look like.
Iwo Jima, probably the outstanding one. But there were a number of those island hopping landings that the Marine Corps made on their way to Japan, and Okinawa was the last one, and then of course that was the South Island of Japan, and then they dropped the atomic bomb, and of course that was the end of the war.
Well, I mean, and there lots of people believe, and I mean, I think they would say that they dropped that because the island hopping was just so incredibly bloody for both sides.
Well, the projections were that it was going to be unbelievably bloody if the Allies had to invade the main islands of Japan.
Yeah. Oh, well, and for anybody who hasn't been to a Pacific island, they tend to be volcanic. I mean, I think that's what they all are. So there's some mountains and things, but down by the beach, there's not much,
No, there's not.
So, and you can't dig in because it's coral and volcanic rock. So, those island landings are some of the most grim accounts of horrible stuff that people have ever been through. Yeah. So that's what he had been through.
Bill Pastore had been through that, and then he had also been through the Korean War.
Which was no picnic either.
No, but he was really a fine fellow, and we stayed friends for the rest of our. Well, he finally passed away a few years ago, but he was a great guy, had a great sense of humor.
And I think that's important for leaders. I think if you look for the humor, be willing.
I think it was from him. As a matter of fact, I know I patterned my leadership on what I learned from him in those 8 years that I was in the reserve with him.
Yeah, tell me more.
And well, he taught me, that there were two ways. He didn't teach me by teaching. He
didn't sit you down with chalkboard. Yeah.
I learned by observing him that there are basically two ways to get people to do things. In other words, to be a leader.
Yeah.
One way is by having people fear you so much that they do it out of fear. And that can be effective, but in my experience, people that lead by fear are always going to end up losing, because in the end, when the people get an opportunity, they'll let him down.
Yeah. Yep.
By far, the more beneficial way and better way to be a leader is to lead because it's you. The people have respect. They respect you, and because it's you that's saying, let's do this or do that, they do it.
Yeah.
Not because they're afraid, but because they respect you. And so,
and you're talking about having people do things when you say them that put their life in just absolute jeopardy, like really clear and present jeopardy, not like driving to the grocery store puts your life at risk, because it does a little bit. Like you're talking about having people go into something designed to try to kill them.
That's true, but it's also effective because when you're in a job situation, for example, and you tell somebody to do something and they might not think it's necessary or or something, but they do it because it's you that's telling them, and they know that you're not going to tell them to do something that isn't appropriate. And so then, you start looking around and you wonder how do people get that respect? How do they gain that respect from the people under them? And and over time, I've seen people fail in that. And so I got to thinking, how do you get that? And I think the first way is you've got to know your people.
Yeah. Okay. Really good.
The other day I was watching television and they had an episode of Mission Impossible.
Right.
And he goes and he picks up the phone and he says, "Mr. Phelps, your mission, should you decide to accept it, is da 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 da."
Yeah.
And then it shows him, he goes home and he has a folder. And he opens the folder and here are pictures of all of the people on his team. He starts going through that folder and he picks out this one and puts that one aside and picks this one, puts that one aside. And that's exactly what I'm saying when I say you have to know your people.
Right.
When I became an officer in the Marine Corps and I got my first platoon, I got myself a little 3x5 black loose leaf thing that I could put in my pocket.
That's my mom.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And
it's okay.
And I wrote down the name of everybody in my platoon. And then I made little notes about them, where they were from, who their parents were, how far they had gotten in school. Who did they have brothers and sisters? Did they have a girlfriend or just little things? And then I would also note everybody has something that they do really well.
Yeah.
And you make notes about what they do really well.
Yeah.
For example, I had one young guy. He was a great big burly guy, and he was so big that they kept trying to put him in the fat boy platoon to trim him down.
Right.
But he wasn't fat; he was muscle.
He was just a gigantic thing of muscles.
He was scared to death of a rifle. They'd take him to the rifle range, and he would blow it. He never even fired marksman. He was so scared.
Because that big loud bang right there by his face and
the recoil scared
the kick.
Scared the puppy out of him.
Yeah.
And so then the Marine Corps came out with a grenade launcher. And it was a very effective weapon, but it had no recoil.
Yeah.
And so I said to this kid, let's see how you do with this. He was so proficient with that thing that he could put that grenade through the window of a car 300 yards out.
Wow.
And he loved that thing. So,
well, and he's big and burly enough he can carry a load of grenades. So perfect. Match made in heaven because you were paying attention.
Yeah. And you've got to make notes of those things, It would have been useless to try to put him with a rifle or a machine gun because he couldn't do it. But
so interesting.
And then you have to make notes of what these people can do. In a military situation, is the guy a good observer? If he's a good observer, he's the guy that you want to send out on patrol.
Yeah.
Because he's going to come back and he's going to tell you really good information. Things like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the next thing is that people have to trust you. And trust is a two-way thing. You've got to trust them and they've got to trust you. So it's not a matter of just of doing things for people. You've got to know what they can do and then get the hell out of the way and let them do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, tell us that story about when you were part of the delegation to meet
Prime Minister Sato.
Yes, Prime Minister Sato. Yeah, this is this is a story that I think if we as leaders could get the depth and the power of this story, it would just change everything. So I love this story.
So I had been medically evacuated back to Okinawa in the fall of 1965. And at that time, no sitting prime minister of Japan had ever visited Okinawa since the end of the war. And so there was a big to-do about having Prime Minister Sato come to Okinawa. And of course, they had an honor platoon from each of the services set up at the airport to greet Prime Minister Sato. And I was assigned to be the platoon leader for the Marine Corps platoon. And so on the opening day, when we first went to have our first rehearsal, we got out of the buses and everything, and everybody fell in and lined up in our platoons. And the colonel asked for a report, so you say, all present accounted for, sir. And then he said, take charge of your platoons and march them over to that area over there. Right? Aye, sir. I turned around. I said, platoon sergeant, front center. Platoon sergeant comes up. I said, take charge of the platoon and march them over there. Aye, sir. And I turned around and started walking over there. And the colonel came walking over to me and he said, Lieutenant, don't you think it would be a good idea for you to march your platoon over there? I said, no, sir. If the Marine Corps had wanted me to march them over there, they wouldn't have given me a platoon sergeant. And he looked at me and says, that's probably right.
I love it.
And after that, he would come over and he'd ask me, Lieutenant, can I borrow your platoon sergeant to help one of these other platoons with their marching,
Yeah. Because the Marines know how to march. I don't know about those Navy guys marching.
I mean, all of the platoons were just thrown together.
Yeah, they were all a bunch of wounded men, and right. Anybody that could walk.
I had one guy in my platoon who wasn't even able to carry a rifle until the day of the actual show. When Prime Minister Sato came.
Yeah,
and none of them had ever been. We didn't have organized platoons and squads and so forth, and so it was. It was really quite a job for that colonel to beat that group together so that it made an honorable impression. But
yeah. Well, it's one of the things I love about the military, Dad, and one of the things that I really, I think it was a huge impact on me when I was little growing up with you guys is, in the military, like you just got to deal with other people, You don't get to pick and choose. And those were the men that were there that were available for this. That colonel had to be smart enough and a good enough leader that he could pull this group together, even though they weren't used to being a group and you had not that much time. And I love just being with people that are just good being with people, they're just, here we go. Like, this is the group today.
Yeah. But I mean, this goes back to what I was talking about, trust. I knew that my platoon sergeant, even though he was junior to most of the other sergeants, to all of the other sergeants in all of the other platoons, I knew that he could do this and do a good job at it.
Yeah.
And so, you got to know your people, and then you've got to have trust in them. And they've got to trust you. He knew when I called him out, he trusted me. I was going to give him that job and so forth. Yeah. And that trust goes both ways. And I think about when I was in Hawaii, we went on a training mission one time, and it was a company thing, and it was a combat readiness test.
Uh-huh.
And we were supposed to make a night assault on this one hill.
And Dad, when you say it's a company thing, that means that doesn't mean it's a corporate thing. It means it's a pretty big exercise.
We had our 3 infantry platoons and a weapons platoon.
Okay.
So I mean, it was a good sized thing, and we were led. I won't give you his name, but we were led by a lieutenant who had been an enlisted man before and had gotten out and gone to college and then got a commission.
And you did that too, right? You went in as enlisted. Is that called being a Maverick?
Maverick. No, a Mustang.
Yeah. A Mustang. Why do I always do that? It's because you used to drive a Maverick.
That's true.
So a Mustang sounds better.
But there was one thing about him that always had bothered me, and it bothered everybody else, and that was he told me one time we were on maneuvers, and it came time for dinner, and I went over and sat with my troops and was eating with my troops, telling jokes and everything, and we were having a good time. And after dinner, he called me over and he said, I noticed, Lieutenant, that you went over and had dinner with your troops instead of coming over with the officers and NCOs. And I said, well, yes, Lieutenant. I said, that's the only, we don't get to see that much of them when we're when we're not out on maneuvers. They're always off to some school or something. And I said, this is the only chance I really get to sit down and talk with them, get to know them. And he said, but you were telling jokes. I said, well, you've got to get to the same level with the people. And he says, well, I try to rise above them. And that was so indicative of his leadership thing. This was that fear versus respect thing.
Yeah. And so, and the poor guy had bad role models, I'm sure, but
But so on this night, instead of sending, he had some wonderful NCOs. Instead of sending them out to map out the route, you can map it out on the map, and then you have to have somebody go out and physically lay it out so you know where they're going at night. And instead of sending his NCOs out to do that, he tried to go out and do that himself. And then when night came and we actually started out, it was a cold, rainy night in Molokai. And cold, rainy nights in Hawaii are not fun. And we started out. Luckily, my platoon was sent to take a hill that was overlooking the route of approach. So we weren't there when this happened, but he started leading the company, the whole company, minus my platoon, cross country instead of following down a road. You don't go on the road, but you follow the road. He started going cross country and got lost.
Oh.
And after a while, the colonel who was judging the combat readiness of our company stood up and said, "Lieutenant, this is the worst example of leadership I have ever witnessed in my career in the Marine Corps. You're relieved." And he called for the next junior lieutenant, who was me, who wasn't there to come and take over. And so then he called the next one, and he said, "Get this company online and let's assault this hill right here and get out of here." And he was relieved. And the reason was because he didn't trust the people that were under him to do the job that he had to get done. And so this trust is a two-way thing. You have to trust the people under you, and they have to trust you. And that happened here. Was they didn't trust him. They got lost. It was just a tragic thing.
Yeah. Well, and another thing I hear in that, Dad, definitely the trust thing, and not having that kind of a relationship with your team where, like, you knew he had great non-commissioned officers, NCOs. It seems like maybe he didn't, so maybe he should have had, sat down and told some jokes and broken some bread with them a little bit more. The other thing I hear in that is something that I think about a lot. This is one of the things that I just hear in my head all the time. And I've heard, and especially in times when it's really stressful and we're under pressure. But you told me once that you would never ask any of your men to do something that you weren't willing to do yourself. And there were things that you couldn't do, right? And because you were the commander, you couldn't, it would be a bad idea for you to go do that thing. And this seems like one of those situations too. I mean, luckily, even though it was a bad night in Molokai, you were still on Molokai, right?
Yep.
If he had done this in Vietnam, all of them would probably be dead.
Well, I had a friend who was a West Point graduate, and but he also never seemed to get this trusting your NCOs. And he was on a night combat patrol in Vietnam, and they had set up an ambush on this trail that the Viet Cong customarily used.
Mm-hmm.
And during the night, they heard a noise down the trail, but nothing ever developed in the ambush.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than sending an NCO and or somebody out to find out to scope this out.
Well, and Dad, maybe he had somebody on his team who was particularly good at moving quietly at night, very observant, call him the cat,
His platoon sergeant was excellent at that.
Yeah, right.
But instead of doing that, he took his radio man and he went down the trail himself, and he, without telling anybody, and walked back into his own ambush and was killed. He and his radio man were both killed.
Oh,
I mean, and it's tragic.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And that's because, I've always associated that with not trusting his subordinates to do the job that he would assign them to do.
Right. Right.
And
I mean, I think that's right.
But the important thing here, though, is that people sense whether you trust them or don't trust them.
Yes. Yeah, that's your paleo mammalian brain. It's been around since forever. All mammals have one.
Yeah.
And it can't talk to you with language. The way it communicates with you is gut feelings. And it's the thing that's reading all those facial micro expressions and the pheromones that are being released, and people know.
And that's how your subordinates know if you trust them or don't trust them.
Yeah.
And that trust is terribly important to be an effective leader.
Yeah.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, and in addition to that, it's fairness. They have to know and understand that that you're going to be fair with them in all of your dealings.
Yeah.
You have to be fair. That's how you build that trust, is by being fair with them.
Yeah.
And without if they sense that you're not going to be fair with them, then you've lost it.
Well, let's talk about when you were protecting Highway 1, and it's not the Highway 1 we all know and love here in the States and in California as a surfer. This was Highway 1 in Vietnam near.
Yeah. Going from Da Nang to Hue. And on up to, it was the main highway in Vietnam. And I had a squad size outpost that was 500 yards in front of the main line of our battalion perimeter.
It doesn't sound like all that far. Like, it's not far to drive or fly, but that's a long way to walk in the dark with, people that have guns who are trying to hurt you.
So we had a perimeter. We had a perimeter around our position.
How did you set that perimeter?
Well, we took the guy that could throw a big rock the furthest, and we
simulating a grenade.
We had located our foxholes, and we had him stand in each foxhole and throw the rock as far as he could, and then we'd move it out about another 6 feet, and that's where we put our barbed wire.
Yeah, figuring that probably nobody could throw them in at you that far at that point. So,
and then I had my command foxhole in the middle, and we were right with the highway going down between us. But as it turns out, we were right on the edge of a cemetery. And so, at night in Vietnam, when there was no moon, it was dark.
Yeah, like we're talking multiple canopy forest.
And so one night, we were sitting there. We had a phone line between each of the foxholes and the command hole.
Mm-hmm.
One night, this one young Marine called, and he said, "Lieutenant, the gravestone's growing." And I said, "Oh, you're sure it's growing?" And he said, "Yes, I'm sure it's growing." And I said, "Well, just keep your eye on it. Tomorrow night, we'll bring down the sniper rifle, which had an infrared scope on it."
That was pretty new at that point.
It was. And I said, "So just keep your eye on it and keep us posted on how it's going." So the next night.
Well, and so, Dad, let's revisit that for just a second, because that took. You didn't say, "What are you smoking, crack again?" I mean, I guess there wasn't really crack back then, but you've been hitting the ganja, son. You didn't say any of that. You said, "Okay, great, keep an eye on it." Yeah, because you trusted this guy.
Well, and he trusted me to say that too. Because
exactly. That must have been hard for him to say, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna get a psych. You looking for a psych discharge here?
So the next night. We brought the sniper rifle down with the sniper scope and everything. And about the same time, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, he called me and he said, "Lieutenant, that gravestone's growing again." So we took the sniper scope down to his position. And when you looked through it, the infrared, it was in fact growing. And what was happening was a Viet Cong was crawling up behind this stone. And then he ever so slowly, he would stand up. And then he would observe what was going on in our position. And later, 2 weeks later, we got a Viet Cong who had all these notes from our position in his possession that had apparently been collected by this guy. And
it made it seem like they were going to probably overrun you in the next couple of nights.
They were going to try,
try. That's the important distinction. I got it.
So, I gave the sniper rifle back to the guy, and I said, do your job. And so he did. But he was aware enough that he was able to distinguish that there was something going on in front of him.
Yeah.
He had trust to tell me about it, and we were able to take out a threat to our position.
Yeah. And the human side of that, I think about that guy a lot, Dad.
Well, you wrote a magnificent poem about that story that I told you when you were very young.
Yeah. And maybe I'll post that poem along with this episode.
I think you should, because that's really a fine poem.
Well, thank you. Because the patience that it took that guy, and the dedication and the self-control, and I think it's one of the horrible things about war is we take our best stuff and just destroy it.
Yeah.
And had you not done that, they would have tried to overrun you, and that could have gone a bunch of different ways, and no one wants to, none of us on this side wanted to find out. Right. So
in the event, after this spy, was shot, about an hour later, we had an attack on my position on the other side.
Oh, wow.
And in those days, the Viet Cong had been spreading a rumor around through the villages that they could not be killed. And so they attacked us over there to draw our attention over that way. And then they came in and stole his body.
Uh-huh.
So,
I see.
So we were not able to recover the Viet Cong, even though we were able to see the remnants of where he had been and everything.
Right.
But so there was an attack planned. It just never came off.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm, the tragedies of war, and I will admit, selfish though, I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah. Well, I am too.
Yeah. So, and that position is also strong in my mind, because if I'm not mistaken, you can't just set up your concertina wire and call the perimeter done.
No.
You got to actually go make sure everything's okay once in a while, right?
Yep.
Will you tell us about that?
Yeah, we had every little once in a while, because the Viet Cong were good at sneaking around, and they could come up, and if they, and cut the concertina wire and then have a route into your position, we would have one of the guys get up, and he would go out and patrol around the wire to make sure it was still okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so
would you send one person out by themselves, or would you
we'd send one person out, but have him covered by others?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay. So where does the thing come from? Which story is it that I'm conflating here? Because you told me always know like where your people are and be empathetic with their situation, know what's happening for them. And maybe it was just on general patrols. A good leader would stop about every 5 minutes and let everybody take a pee, because it's so darn scary that if you didn't do that, people would wet their pants.
To begin with, whenever you start out on a patrol, particularly when it's new to you.
Yeah.
That's when you have that.
Right. So for the new people, make sure you go to the bathroom before we get in the car.
Yeah. But that was always something that you wanted to do, was make sure everybody was comfortable as they were going down and could concentrate on what they were doing rather than on what they might have to do.
Right. Yeah. Very well said. But to, like maybe, if someone's done this a lot, they might forget that, hey, it's this guy's first time, and maybe I should remind him, and hey, maybe we ought to find a good place and scope it out and stop for a minute to.
The other thing is, though, is that, if a guy has to go, he should tell his patrol leader.
That's a really, really good point.
Should be aware enough to say, okay, let's stop. Let's do this, But that's that trust again.
Yeah.
That trust.
Absolutely.
And that fairness and faith.
Yes. That really is, it is what it is, that is just the key. And, speaking of fairness and faith, there's a story I remember because, you were in charge of, I guess you had 6 Ontoses.
Five
Ontoses. And so an Ontos is an anti-tank vehicle that was developed during the Korean War, I believe. Or is that right?
Yeah.
Or end of World War II, or
it was a weapon that the Marine Corps had from after the Korean War, and it was about the size of a 3/4 ton truck, and had 6 106 recoilless rifles mounted on it, in a configuration of 2 and 1 in the center, and then on the other side 2 up and 1 in the center, and 4 of those had 50 caliber spotting rifles mounted on them. And then on the top, the turret rotated, and then there was a 30 caliber machine gun that was mounted on the top of that, and it could be fired from either inside of the vehicle, or that you could open the hatch and get out and manually fire it. But that was quite a weapon.
But the Viet Cong didn't have tanks at the time.
The Viet Cong didn't have tanks at the time, and so the problem is that with nothing to do, I was concerned that my people were going to go bonkers.
Yeah, and so it's human. That's human.
And so we could elevate and depress those 106 recoilless rifles from inside of the machine. And so I got to thinking, if you elevate it, you could shoot indirect fire.
Right.
So I went over to the firing officer in charge of the 106 recoilless rifles, and I'm sorry about that, but
that's okay. It happens.
So in charge of the 105 howitzers.
Do you want to just hit it again, Dad?
Yeah, I don't know.
There you go.
So I went over to the firing officer from the howitzer platoon, and so we went out and set up. We surveyed 3 of my Ontos into position along with his howitzers, and so then we started firing. And it turned out that the firing table for a 106 recoilless rifle is the same as a 105 howitzer charge 5 minus 1 click.
Awesome. Well, that was a really helpful thing to figure out.
Yeah. So whenever the howitzers would displace forward to cover an operation, my Ontos, we would go along as security for the howitzers. But once we got into position, they'd survey 3 of my Ontos in, and we would fire along with the howitzers whenever we were there. There was firing required.
And you guys were able to get on target faster than a howitzer, weren't you?
We could, because there was no recoil.
Right.
And so, but then we could fire those guns 1 at a time, 2 at a time, or in any combination up to 6 at a time. So when they would give the order, fire for effect, we'd fire all 6 rounds at once. And the forward observers told me that was quite a show when those suckers
when
hit.
they all arrived at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah.
Did they all fire at exactly the same time, or was it
Exactly
just
the same.
boom?
Yeah. And it was
Wow.
fun because we fired the ones that had a tracer element, and you
Uh-huh.
watch them go up. And since the guns were aimed at 1,500 yards,
Uh-huh.
they'd go up like this, and then they'd cross over. And it was
Oh,
really,
okay.
it was a
Wow.
fun sight.
Yeah. I mean, and for anybody that was pinned down or in a bad way up front, they were pretty happy to see those things come howling in, right?
And the forward observer told me they would make a mess out of wherever they landed.
Yeah, which was the objective.
And the other thing that we did was because howitzers were relatively difficult to maneuver, whenever there was a suspected harboring site for the Viet Cong, I could take my guns out and we could then make a mess out of the suspected harboring site. And so we did that a lot.
So you're the guy technically who pioneered using the ontos for indirect and supporting fire.
Right.
Well, congratulations, Captain Bates.
Well, I mean, we didn't have anything else to do. There weren't any tanks.
Yeah, right. Make yourself useful now.
There was another thing that we used to do too, and that is we'd go out on a hill in full view of all of the little villages around. And because there was that tremendous backblast from the 106 when you fired it,
right,
we'd go out on the top of those hills and we'd fire some rounds at suspected targets, in full view of the villages. It was a fearsome weapon to them. And so in addition to doing that, I would assign 2 ontos at either end of the area where we were protecting Highway 1 with the roadblock. We had a roadblock at the south end and at the north end. And they'd just sit there, because they were such a fearsome weapon. It added credibility to the people that were running the roadblock.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and you didn't go sit up on the hill and shoot those things off to scare the villagers. You did that to show them that you
impressed them.
Yeah, had the power to protect them potentially, and that so because there was it was not to get too political about it, but you did tell me that after you got there, you realized the people that you had come to rescue and save really didn't want you there. Right.
Well, it was not so much that they didn't want us there. It was that, there was a feeling generally that it was pretty much the same whether you were under Viet Cong control or under the other control.
Right.
And, but I mean, they were happy to have us there because at that stage of the war, the Viet Cong were pretty vicious. I mean, they'd take village chiefs out and kill them. And at least when we were there, the village chiefs and that were pretty secure.
Yeah. So tough, really tough.
Yeah.
Tough situation. Again, I mean, I think there's a lot about trust both ways there and all that kind of stuff. And it just,
There are 2 other things characteristics though, that I think are required for a good leader. And one of them is integrity. For a Marine officer, integrity is everything.
Yeah.
And the other thing is honesty. You have to be honest with your troops. And if you're honest with your troops and you have integrity, then, that really kind of rounds out the leadership characteristics, I think, that a good leader has to have.
Yeah. What would you say integrity is? How would you define it, Dad?
Integrity is being straightforward, not being devious, doing what you say you're going to do, and always being fair. Integrity is, I don't know. I guess I figure integrity is the characteristic that you have that lets people know that if you say it, it's right, and that's what you believe.
Yeah.
And
You
then
know,
you will do what you say you're going to do.
yeah. I heard a really great definition. Um, Tell me what you think. Integrity is honoring your word,
Yeah.
because you're not always going to keep your word, right?
Yeah.
Like even the Blue Angels don't keep their word. But the minute that they know they're not going to make that maneuver on time, they're a little late or they're a little ahead, they'll tell the other person that's involved immediately as soon as they know. The other person can compensate and they can still pull off the maneuver, right? So
Right.
it's not purely keeping your word. It is absolutely honoring your word.
That's true.
And I think that's really great. And then, doing things the way they're meant to be done, whether anybody's watching or not,
Yeah.
And then, the other thing that I love, Dad, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this and see if there's any places you can plug it back in to your experiences. The other side of the coin of integrity, and this is the one that made it a lot easier for me to start being on time. I guess I should make that confession to you here. I'll do that in just a second. But the other side of the coin of integrity that I think doesn't get talked about nearly enough is that it is actually a matter of integrity to have an empowering context for yourself and your life. So if you do not have an empowering context, that's okay for like a day or two, but immediately it is incumbent on you to get back to an empowering context. And that really hit me. Does that land for you?
I think that's absolutely true. You've got to know where you're going and what you're going to do, what you want to accomplish, and why.
Yes, and why. So, Dad, I'll tell you, I remember distinctly, and, after hearing all these stories, I think people are going to get where you were coming from and what a snotty-nosed brat I kind of was. But I remember, so I'm going to confess to you about how I was resisting you for so long and how I finally got over that. So I remember coming home, and I was supposed to be home by midnight, right? And I dropped my girlfriend off and I drove and tried not to speed, but tried to go as fast as I could. And I was like a minute late, And I remember walking in the house and you were standing there, and I'm going to call you out in your tidy whities with your wristwatch on. And I walked in and you looked at your watch and you said, "It's 12:01. If this were an ambush, we'd all be dead. You're grounded for a week,"
Yeah.
And I was grounded for a week. And boy, as a teenager, that was just like, that was a big deal. And I was upset. And so then I think I spent subconsciously the next, 20 years resisting being on time because, you're a Marine. So on time was everything. And so I was going to do the exact opposite, right? Just cause I still wish I wouldn't have done that, but whatever. Then I really got this for myself around being on time, because at a certain point, I just decided this was like beneath me to always be late and not be able to pull it off and trying to be on time and then just not. And so I did a little thought experiment for myself. And I thought, okay, let's imagine there are two people. And the first thing was, the other thing about integrity, Dad, that I love about the definition I was given is that it strips morality out of it. There's no morality. You're not better than someone because you have integrity, or worse, you just have integrity and they don't, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And you can pull, because if there is, a Satan or whatever, some supreme evil, I'm sure that supreme evil has tons of integrity.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like they wouldn't do what they said they would do.
No.
So integrity and morality are separate things.
Mm-hmm.
They're both important, but they're different. And so that was a big step for me, right? Because I had those two things massively tangled up. I got those things apart. And then I had this thought experiment of two people, one of whom knows they make a difference. They're out to make a difference. They care about making a difference, and they know they make a difference. The other person doesn't really get that they make a difference. They still don't think they make a difference. which of those two people would be on time? The one who knows they make a difference, right?
Right.
Clearly.
Yeah.
So, and when I realized that, it got much easier for me. It was actually like day and night. All of a sudden, being on time mattered to me in a different way, and I was able to pull it off regularly. And it's just made my life exquisite, you know?
It makes it nice if you're not late.
Right. I mean, and, even coming to this call, right at 7:15 when we were going to talk, you texted me, I'm in here. I was having a problem with the software on my end. So, could have been there earlier to get that problem worked out. Didn't expect it. But hey, we got going at 7:46 versus, or 7:16 versus 7:20 or 25 or whatever it might have been in the past.
Uh-huh.
So thanks for all the lessons, Dad. I really appreciate it.
That's the way we go, in life, and I was very blessed in my life to have great people around me, and I've been very fortunate to have children that grew up and didn't give us too much trouble.
Yep. Hey, and I have a woman who is a friend of mine whom I supported on a TEDx talk recently. She's the author of a book called Mirror Thinking. Her name's Fiona Murden. And what she talks about is that mirroring other people, seeing others' behaviors, what you talked about with Pastori, right? He didn't sit you down with a chalkboard and tell you all about leadership. He just demonstrated it. And you did what we would call mirroring. You mirrored his leadership in your own. Well, that is fundamentally what makes us human.
Yeah.
And that is the most powerful way that we learn things and we become the people that we are hanging out with because we just cannot help but mirror the people around us.
Well, and I think it's important. Leadership isn't just what you do in business or what you do in the Marine Corps or something else. It's also how we raise our children.
Yeah.
In thinking about it, the really important things are know your people, know what they're capable of, teach them if they don't know, and figure out exactly what their strengths are, and then get the hell out of the way.
Yeah.
And facilitate them in accomplishing what they're supposed to accomplish.
Yeah.
Leadership isn't doing it yourself.
Yeah. Well, that's a really, 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 that's a quote I think I'm going to run with. Leadership isn't doing it yourself, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's so obvious in hindsight, and yet it's so profound and good to hear.
But I mean, in a military sense, leadership isn't necessarily being out in front and leading.
Right.
Because in a lot of instances, leadership is exercised at best from somewhere else. And one of the things that they teach you in the Marine Corps in combat readiness, and that is a leader is supposed to position himself where he can best control his unit. And that is not necessarily out in front, but it could be from the rear or could be from someplace in the middle.
Yeah.
But the main thing is you've got to trust the people around you and then know what they can do and then get the hell out of the way and let them do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. So, another thing you told me, and then I think we'll probably wrap it up and maybe I can get you to come back and do this again if you had enough fun this time. You told me early on, I think I was in high school, Dad, and it's something that stuck with me, stuck to this very day. And I'm a better person when I'm conscious of it and doing it. You said, son, be good to the people you see on the way up, because they're the same people you're going to see on the way down. And then you're going to see them on the way up again, and then on the way down again. So just be good to people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Could I tell you one other little story?
I'd love it. I would love it. Would you please?
When I got my first platoon, in those days, the Marine Corps was all volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had all of these young guys were volunteers, or in some instances, they had gotten into trouble, and the court had said, if you go in the military, we won't do anything to you,
Right. Yeah. We'll give you a pass here.
So there were probably, 6 out of 10 that hadn't finished high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I figured, having learned from my dad, that education was terribly important. And so I made it a rule in our platoon, everybody had to be enrolled in one extension course. And that included me.
Yeah.
And it could be an extension course for getting your GED or for improving yourself in your military position or so forth. And my platoon guide was assigned to keep track of all of these situations, what everybody was enrolled in, make sure they got their lessons in on time, and so forth and so on. But when I was in the Great Lakes Naval Hospital years later, a guy came up to me, and he had been one of my Marines in Hawaii, and he had braces on his legs and was walking with crutches, and he said to me, Captain Bates, he says, I wanted to thank you. Said, I hadn't finished high school when I was in your platoon, but you got me involved in taking those extension courses. And he says, I was able to get my degree, my college degree from extension courses over time. And he said, when I got wounded, and he was severely wounded, he stepped on a landmine and it really messed up his legs. Oh. He said, when I was wounded, I was able to finally get my degree here in Chicago. And so now I have a profession that I can exercise outside of the Marine Corps.
Wow.
And I was really, really moved by that.
That's very moving.
Yeah.
The Buddha said, if you make a difference in the life of one person, consider yourself blessed.
I do, very.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you are.
Yeah. Thank you, son.
You're welcome. I sure do love you, Dad.
Love you too.
Didn't think I'd cry on my own podcast. But, that's the thing about leadership, right? Is when it's done really well, when it's done the way it's meant to be done, when it's done with integrity, it leads to great fulfillment.
Yeah.
So thanks for taking the time with me, Dad. And I hope you will come back and now think of the next round of stories. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, you're super welcome. Thank you too, Dad. I really appreciate you joining us.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
Okay.
Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.